Hey everybody, this is Isaiah and welcome back to Magic System Monday. Today I have a question for you as well as an abbreviated answer. How exactly does one judge a magic system? Now, depending on who you ask, you get a lot of answers to this question, but a lot of them vary in how useful they are. And one of the reasons for that is because of subjectivity. Now, naturally, everybody has their own preferences and things they tend to focus on more than others, as well as things that they dislike. And even though you're entitled to those preferences just like anyone else is, using a subjective metric to judge something objectively naturally is not a good idea. But magic systems are so numerous and varied, how could we possibly judge them without adding our own subjective criteria? Because once you stop to think about it, nearly all of those criteria are subjective in one way or another. Well, that's the question I asked myself a few years ago. And this is an abbreviation of the answer that I came up with. The criteria that I judge magic systems on fundamentally are what I like to refer to as the bare bones criteria. Once you boil down all the subjectivity and trim all the fat from your criticism, what are the few things that remain? Things that I know absolutely for certain are not based off of subjectivity. They can be flexible in terms of how they're expressed in different magic systems, but they are objective, or at least as close to objective as I can possibly get, when it comes to criteria for judging whether or not a magic system is good or bad. The first of these three criteria is cohesion. Cohesion represents consistency. When you make the rules of your work of fiction, and the power system specifically, are those rules consistent? That's not to say that you have to explain all of those rules in one lump sum, or that something can't be reinterpreted or revealed later down the line. But in general, once you establish the logic of your work of fiction, you'll want to make sure that none of the logic or sentiment that you've put forth in the work of fiction contradict one another or step on each other's toes, without being reconciled in some way or another. Cohesion is one of the most integral parts of creating a magic system or writing in general. And the reason for that is simple, because consistency is key. It defines people's expectations and whether or not those expectations are fulfilled. It's what's used to set the precedent for setup and payoff. Consistency in the logic is what allows a viewer to continue being attached to a work of fiction as time goes on. If you started watching Star Wars because you like Star Wars, what would happen if 2 movies from now, instead of it being Star Wars, it was JoJo's Bizarre Adventure instead? JoJo's Bizarre Adventure may not even be bad, but that's not what you came for. Moreover, if the rules change as time goes on, in a way that doesn't make sense, the viewer will have trouble taking things in that work of fiction seriously, because the writer can just reinterpret or change the game at any time he wants. And the more you ruin this foundation, the lack of trust and care that a lot of viewers will have, even if they continue watching. It can also run the risk of adding confusion to fandoms, as everyone starts to have varying and inconsistent interpretations of what's going on and how things work. The second category that I use to grade magic systems is governance. When looking at governance, you ask yourself a very simple question. Are the rules that this work of fiction supposes actually applied to the world building, the characters, and the magic system? Because order and rules are like money. They're not worth anything if you're not actually using them. If you establish rules and decide their precedence within a work of fiction, if a person is to observe that work of fiction, they need to be able to see that those rules actually matter. If you have rules in a work of fiction that don't end up being relevant, those are excess rules that serve no purpose. Moreover, you have to ask yourself the question of whether or not individual facets of a work of fiction behave as if they were beholden to those rules. If something exists in your world building that would logically affect the way people behave and the type of technology that they have, then logically, we should be able to see that the characters and the world are responding to this information and to these facts. If going out at night caused people to turn into monsters, and everyone knew this, then logically people would be doing their darndest to not get caught in the dark. This might perhaps change the way that society has developed. It might limit long-range travel. They might have come up with technology or means of mitigating this risk. And moreover, just about everybody, with few exceptions, would know that this is a risk, and they would act on the personal level with this information in mind. If a writer fails to take this lesson to heart, then information that a writer gives will not be taken seriously by the viewers, because they fail to see any proof of how it tangibly and logically affects the way the world works as a result. And lastly, we have limitation. Limitation is the core of all conflict, of all tension in your work of fiction, and choosing the proper limitations to facilitate the type of story that you want is integral to actually making the story interesting to your target audience. Depending on what type of limitation you have or where you put this limitation in the work of fiction, whether it's directly tied to the magic, whether it's based off of the characters, whether it's in the law, wherever you create these limitations, that's where the conflict is going to stem from. But limitation will also define the shape of resolution of conflict. When we grade a magic system on limitation, we ask ourselves how well do these specific limitations in the story add to the plot's conflict, tension, and conflict resolution. Limitations that work well in one story might not work well in another story. For example, let us say that in a certain magic system, if one is to kill a person with magic, then the person doing the killing would die as well. That might actually be a genuine conflict for when magic is used in combat. However, if that same limitation were used in a different story where there was no killing involved, then that limitation's ability to define the shape of conflict, tension, and conflict resolution will be drastically limited, and it may not even matter at all. Additionally, adding limitations where they need not apply can also produce issues. If one character's position in the plot revolves around him being extremely powerful, then adding a bunch of limitations or weaknesses to his power that make him easily dealt with might limit his ability to be relevant, and serve to call his place in the story into question. And here we are. Those are the 3 abbreviated versions of the criteria that I use when I grade a magic system. Now obviously there are always going to be more things to consider, more specific ways of executing plot and logic in the story, but these are the base rules that I use to prevent myself from letting my own bias or preference get in the way when I'm creating a magic system. But depending on how deep the analysis is that I'm doing, I might actually employ other things. For example, whether or not the magic system is cool or not, and what being cool even means. However, when you do that, you run the risk of adding things that may end up making a magic system seem way better than it actually is, or way worse. In any case, that's all I've got for today. This is Isaiah from Magic System Monday, and I'll see you guys later.